Welcome to tonight's Terror, where you can expect original scary stories. Nothing here is written or narrated by AI. If you enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel and sharing your thoughts in the comments. Thanks for visiting, and enjoy the story.
My mom always told me, get a government job. It was a familiar refrain throughout my childhood, even before I was old enough to work. Obviously, at a young age, I didn't give it much thought. It was the same as hearing, save for a rainy day. I remember once in second grade, I was asked what I wanted to be when I grew up. I quickly said, I want a government job. The teacher laughed. After I graduated high school in '94, I traveled a little, working all sorts of different jobs. Security guard, insurance salesman. I did an apprenticeship as a pipe fitter, but none of it really held my interest very long. This was back when a college education was still a near guarantee of a brighter future. So around the time I turned 23, I finally admitted it was time to go back to school. I had some savings, but not enough to pay my way. I knew I'd need a steady job to have a prayer at covering rent and the cost of classes. After letting my mom's well-worn maxim gather dust my entire life, I began to really think about it. It wasn't hard to see why she'd wanted me in a government job. Above average pay, great health benefits, a retirement plan. For a long time, all of those things seemed secondary to doing something that amused me. Now work was a necessity in a way it hadn't been before. The options were vast. I thought about being a mail carrier, and even got excited about the idea before learning there was a hiring freeze in my state. I decided to keep looking around while I figured out what qualifications were going to help me. It turned out I was reasonably qualified for a lot of state gigs. However, I had to take a civil service exam first. I received the letter verifying that I passed the test the same day I saw the job posting for a toll booth operator. It was tacked to a bulletin board in the vestibule of the post office. I looked both ways, tore it down, shoved it in my pocket. No need for extra competition, I thought. 3 weeks later, I was packing my dinner for my first shift. As low man, I didn't have any choice in shifts. For the first month, I was going to be on graveyard, 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. I'd done my best to adjust my sleep schedule in the days leading up to my first night, with mixed results. I was definitely going to be exhausted by 6 a.m. I had read the introductory materials the union had sent me, and I felt ready. They'd brought me in to shadow a toll collector during the day the week before. He'd shared plenty of useful, but mundane tips. I had warm clothes, a book, and a meal I was looking forward to. When I parked at the toll plaza, there were just 2 other cars. It was much darker than I'd expected. The only lights on were those in the small, concrete office where the supervisor sat, and one overhead floodlight at the only open toll booth in the plaza. It lit the booth and lane passing beside in an orangish glow. They told me I'd want to keep the light inside my booth switched off to make it easier to see out. My supervisor, Ron, saw me as I stepped away from my car and walked toward me with his hand extended. He wore black slacks with a tucked-in white shirt and red tie. There was a button he'd missed, and I could see the pink of his belly through the gap. It was strange to see someone dressed this way at 10 p.m., to sit alone in an office at a toll booth plaza. Was the formal outfit required? Or was that just who Ron was? He pumped my hand enthusiastically, like we'd never met before. With a broad smile, he asked,
"Excited?"
I could smell the sweet onion tang of body odor on him as soon as we were within arm's length.
"Absolutely," I answered with feigned authenticity I don't think he caught. He carried on.
"Oh, this is gonna be great. We're pleased as heck to have you aboard."
"What do I do if I need help?" I asked. It was the only question I still hadn't gotten an answer to.
"No sweat, bud. I'll be in the office there. Usually my sixth sense kicks in if something out of the ordinary is happening on the plaza, but if I don't come out on my own, just call. The phone in your booth rings my office as soon as you pick it up.
He rocked from foot to foot, still wearing that painfully wide smile. It seemed like he was looking through me, or past my eyeballs at my forehead. It made me uncomfortable to be near him. "Thank you. I doubt anything comes up, but that's good to know," I replied.
Yeah, it's plenty quiet on the night shift. Only thing to look out for is drunks. If you think someone isn't safe to drive, you get their plate number and call it in to me.
"Yes, sir."
Oh, there's no sir here. Call me Tom.
He abruptly turned and disappeared into the office. Tom? I thought. Did he just get his own name wrong? I was positive his name was Ron. I even thought I could remember seeing it printed on my schedule. What was up with him? He hadn't seemed so on edge when I'd interviewed. Tonight he was painted with that eerie smile and sweating like a prostitute in church. I decided it didn't matter. With luck, I wouldn't see him again all night. Cautiously, I began to make my way down the line of toll booths toward the one that remained open. I wondered why the booth closest to the office and parking lot wasn't the one chosen to stay open all night. However, I wasn't going to question it. The farther down the line I was, the less I'd see or hear Ron, or whatever he was calling himself tonight. As if he'd heard my thoughts, he called out from the office doorway.
"Hey, bud."
I turned to see his head turned sideways, peeking out the door without opening it all the way. It was almost comical, but the image struck me more like a murdering clown peering out of a bedroom closet. "What's up?" I shouted.
"You're relieving Chester. I should have mentioned. Don't listen to a word he says."
I laughed, assuming this was a playful shot at his employee, but Ron didn't laugh. Before I could ask what he meant, he'd slammed the door. I stared at the office. Ron's silhouette was clearly outlined in the upper half window panel of the door. I was about to turn and carry on when the light in the office suddenly cut out, erasing Ron's image from view. I could only assume that he had turned off the light and was now watching me from the darkness. "What's this guy's deal?" I mumbled aloud as I turned again to my destination. My booth was the second to last in the line of 8. As I approached the aluminum and glass box I'd be spending the night attending, I could see the suggestion of a person inside. As instructed, this Chester guy was keeping his interior light off. I gave a friendly knock on the glass of the sliding door. The figure inside stood and slid the door aside. It raked across the track with a shuddering rattle. I think I can best describe the man inside as a human cigarette. He was shockingly thin. A stained maroon polo shirt hung off his shoulders like a drape on a coat hanger, clinging to the jutting bones of his frame. His shoulders scarcely held up the orange highway authority vest we were all required to wear. His skin was deeply wrinkled and stretched over his features to a cartoonish degree. It took an effort not to stagger back in shock. He had the body and skin of a poorly fed man in his 80s, yet he couldn't have been much past 40. We stood opposite one another for a long, pregnant moment. The lamp overhead buzzed angrily. Finally, he spoke. The voice matched the appearance.
"You're Terry's replacement?"
I raised my eyebrows in exaggerated confusion. "I don't know Terry, but I'm starting tonight." He blew out a long stream of smoke. I hadn't even seen a cigarette. How long had that been in there? I wondered. He spoke again.
"You look about 12. You sure you're up for the graveyard shift?"
I wanted to say, "You look about 100. You sure you should be smoking?" But I didn't. I did my best to not appear rattled by his cold demeanor. I'm old enough to know a good job when I see it. He rolled his eyes and said,
Good job, yeah. Good job to mess you up."
I didn't respond. This guy was obviously an asshole, or high, or both. I just wanted him gone so I could settle in and start reading my book. I was still standing, waiting for him to gather his things and go when he exploded.
"Move!"
He barked, throwing his arms up in sudden exasperation. I stepped aside and spoke, though I knew I'd gain nothing by it. "Whatever, man. Have a chill night." He walked out of the booth, holding an old-fashioned metal lunch pail in one hand and a brown paper bag in the other. I stood in the doorway, satisfied to watch him go. He turned, apparently not done trying to intimidate me. Before I could react, he'd thrust the paper bag into my chest with enough force to make me gasp for a breath. It was more like a punch.
A welcome present for your buddies at the local 510.
He rasped, more smoke impossibly billowing from his mouth. When was he taking these drags off a cigarette? He finally walked off. I could hear him, 2 booths down the line, chuckling and repeating,
Good job! Oh, what a good job.
As I watched him go, it struck me that I was not going to be making friends here. I smoothed out the crumpled paper bag and inside found a trucker cap. The local 510 logo, my new union's emblem, was stitched on the front. I set it on top of the cash register thinking, keep the cap, lower the dues. The first 90 minutes of my shift passed without incident. I collected tolls from 38 cars. I counted. If it was that slow from 10 to 11:30, I could just guess how light the work would be from midnight to the morning commute. I could read my book. I was in the middle of East of Eden. And sip coffee with very occasional interruptions. It was easy to see cars coming in the dark. I figured out that I could read until the moment the car had snuck under the toll plaza's overhang and still be ready, leaning forward to take the toll by the time they'd stopped. Most drivers didn't even look at my face. They'd thrust their hand out and drop something between a quarter and a $5 bill into my hand. I'd just say, thank you, or sometimes, have a nice night. Once I'd grown daring and said, have a safe drive, but the person had cocked their head and looked at me funny, so I retired that one quickly. The first driver to speak more than a word or two drove a pristine, midnight blue Cadillac. Its coat glimmered brightly, even in the dim light of the toll plaza. A well-dressed, older man, maybe 60, peered up at me with an incredulous expression.
And what do we call this?
He asked, regarding me with his chin tucked down to his chest. This is Herkimer, New York. You can pick up Route 28 here, I answered briskly, privately pleased to sound like a veteran. He blinked for a long moment and blew air out of his nose like I'd annoyed him.
I don't need a cartographer, young man.
He scolded.
I'm simply inquiring as to who is occupying Terry's booth.
Oh, I began, surprised to hear this erstwhile's employee's name for the second time tonight. I get the impression she moved on. This is my first night on the job. I regretted adding that immediately, but he seemed to ignore it.
Moved on? Who has taken her?
He demanded. His voice had lost the timbre of a refined grandfather. He sounded panicked. Took her? I repeated. I don't know. I never even met her, man.
This won't do,
he blustered. A flummoxed expression contorted his face. He was speaking like an oil tycoon from the Gilded Age. I did my best not to crack a smile. He was the third person I'd spoken to tonight who acted like an exaggerated version of someone. The stressed boss, the jaded burnout, and now the prickly Mr. Moneybags. He seemed to decide on something and turned to me again.
Boy, you can tell whoever put you in that chair that this isn't through. Not by any measure. Others will come.
Before I could respond, not that I had anything to say, he floored it. And I mean floored it. His tires screamed as the car lurched forward and into the darkness. At the sound of the tires, I turned and looked to the office, curious to see if Ron would have perked up and come out to have a look. He didn't. The office sat dark and silent. Was he even in there? I wondered. I'd have preferred he wasn't at this point. That would be far less unsettling than the notion of him standing behind the door, cloaked in shadow, watching me work. I sat, bewildered, as the stink of burnt rubber slowly dissipated, trying to parse out all of what the old Cadillac driver had said. Eventually, I gave up. I settled back into my book. As midnight approached, a fog began to settle in the valley where the toll plaza was situated. Moonlight filtered through the thickening mist, casting a silver glow on the deserted lane stretched before me. The toll booth, my small, brightly lit island, seemed to float in the swirling vapor. Soon, the fog intensified, wrapping the plaza in a silent, clammy embrace. Visibility shrank. the world reduced to a pool of light cast by the booth's overhead lamp. Then, out of the swirling white nothingness, headlights would appear. Car would glide into the light, a driver's face scarcely illuminated as they paid, and then the vehicle would vanish back into the mist, leaving me alone again. Over the next hour, I saw maybe 10 cars. Each one felt like a fleeting visitor from another realm, a momentary visitation to my lonely station. While it wasn't easy to see into the cars or the drivers' faces, it was clear enough that these late-night travelers did not care for small talk or smiles. They all stared straight ahead as they handed me their money, their faces set on neutral. But as I would turn to the register to make change, I could swear that they would turn and sneer. I couldn't say for sure. My peripheral vision was weaker than usual, trying to glean details in the gloom. Yet it happened again and again, as if this intermittent convoy of drivers had something in common, something against me. I tried to take stock and get a grip on my imagination. This was my first ever shift. I didn't know what normal was. But what happened next could not be categorized as normal. An unfamiliar buzzer sound cut through the quiet of the night. Again, I looked to the office door, expecting Ron to step out and explain. The buzzing continued as I stared. I even made an exaggerated, "What's this?" gesture toward the office, both palms turned upward. Nothing. Then, the toll gates, even those in deactivated booths, began to rise in unison. They were all entirely up. The buzzing alarm stopped. I picked up the phone and immediately heard its muffled ringing in the office. Ron didn't pick up. I let it ring for 30 seconds before hanging up. He was either dead asleep or ignoring me, willfully. Then, a set of headlights pierced the fog. Before I could form a plan, a rusty, brick-red pickup veered into my lane of the plaza and creaked to a stop. The truck was an older model. The bed had wooden planks mounted above the side panels, like you'd see for transporting farm workers or crops. The driver cranked down the window and pushed his head almost entirely out of the car. He appeared to be a farmer in his 50s, but one sculpted from sun-baked clay and weathered wood. His overalls, thick and stiff with grime, looked less like clothing and more like a second skin molded to the contours of his frame. His face was a road map of wrinkles etched by decades of squinting. He was a caricature of a farmer, another exaggerated figure in the night's bizarre cast. Finally, he spoke.
"So, you're the new one, huh?"
I didn't answer. He continued.
"Don't get too comfy in there. Someone will be by soon enough to take you. Maybe I'll take another pass myself."
"Who?" I asked, a tremor creeping into my voice. "Take me where?" He looked me up and down, sizing me up or trying to ascertain if I was being serious.
"Take you yonder. Beyond."
He leaned back into the driver's seat and looked ahead at the raised toll bar.
"Looks like no charge tonight, huh, kid?"
Before I could respond, he'd hit the accelerator, and the truck was coughing and bumping away into the grasping fog. I turned again to gesture at the darkened office window. It was clear that Ron wasn't going to be much use to me, but I could imagine it would be his ass, as well as mine, if cars just zoomed through for free all night. In that instant, the light above my booth cut out. The little fan clamped to the counter hummed to a stop. The numbers on the cash register disappeared. Glancing down the plaza, I saw the single floodlight mounted to the office roof shut off too. The parking lot and office fell into shadow. I was getting set to dash across the plaza to the office when I heard a door slam. In the phantom light of the moon, I saw Ron dashing from the office like a man possessed. He streaked across the pavement to the parking lot. Tossing a crazed glance over his shoulder as he fumbled wildly with his keys, he shouted,
Sorry, kid!
The car door slammed, and he yanked it into reverse, jerking out of the parking spot too fast. The back passenger corner of his sedan crunched against a concrete barrier. A sharp crack split the air as his taillights shattered, scattering red and orange shards across the pavement. Undeterred, he floored it. The tires screeched, and the car shot out onto the road, disappearing into the fog. I sat, heavily, on the metal stool, struck dumb by the bizarre chain of events. Sorry, I thought. Sorry, I'll be right back. Sorry, but you're fired. Then I thought of the farmer in the pickup. Sorry, but someone is coming to take you beyond. Despite Ron's wacko behavior, it was a comfort knowing I hadn't been alone. What was I meant to do now? Something was wrong with this place. I clutched my book in both hands, wringing Steinbeck's words like a dish rag. I needed to make a decision. It was simple enough. Stay or go. I knew leaving the toll plaza unattended would mean the end of my employment for the State Highway Authority before HR even processed my paperwork. Staying, though, what did that mean? Could it be that I would simply sit in the booth reading for a few hours more and then drive home at 6? But given the sequence of events since parking my car, that outcome was feeling less and less assured. I piled my things neatly on the counter. Hat, book, lunch, and coat. If I made a move to leave, I could snatch my stuff and be out of here fast. As I stood on the lip of the step of my booth, teetering quite literally between staying and going, the phone rang. The sound was shrill against the silence. I stared at the phone for 3 rings before cautiously picking it up. The line was silent, just the droning electric buzz of the handset. I finally spoke. Hello? Ron? A soft, sinister wheeze answered me.
You shouldn't be here.
Here? I answered. Here where? Can you see me right now?
Don't you like the hat?
Then the line clicked. Whoever it was had hung up. I'd had enough. I was getting out. Enough things had happened. Enough things said for me to begin taking it seriously. I locked the cash register and put the key in my pocket. The bands of fog had settled in heavily in a ring around the plaza. I peered into the dark, listening for any signal of an approaching car. The buzz of the light over the booth was the only sound marring the stillness of the night. At a quick jog, I covered the ground between the booth and the office in seconds. When I reached it, I turned and looked out. Still no vehicles approaching. It didn't matter. I could use the office phone to get an outside line and call the cops. I'd tell them what happened and that I refused to finish my shift. My boss ditched me. They'd be lucky I even bothered to tell them. I gripped the door handle. It didn't budge. Ron had locked the office. Shit, I hissed. There would be no courtesy call to the police then, at least not until I got home. I fished in my pocket for my car keys, but when I looked down at my hand, I saw only the key to the cash register. My head snapped up to look at the booth. As I watched, the lights came back to life and bathed the booth in orange. It looked like a little oasis of light 50 yards away, almost beckoning me back. I knew that piled neatly on the counter were my hat, book, lunch, and coat. And inside the coat, my car keys. Somberly, I began walking back across the lanes. Dread weighed heavily on the center of my chest as I passed each darkened toll booth and drew closer to the one I'd abandoned. Soon enough, I was standing back in the booth, donning my jacket as I stared up the exit ramp. Headlights, piercing the fog, an engine, and then I saw it, cutting through the fog at a crawl, the brick red pickup truck. The driver, still the cookie-cutter farmer, now sat beside a passenger, Ron. His head was in his hands, his fingers raking through his hair. I thought I could see him shuddering, as if he was in tears. The farmer turned and spoke to him.
This one too?
Ron didn't look up. With his hands still masking his face, he nodded.
Yeah, him too.
I took a step back. I could see the bed of the pickup better from this angle. On wooden benches, fixed to the truck bed, sat 6 figures. I squinted and tilted my head up to get a better look. They were bound with thin green rope at the wrist. They all wore blindfolds of pale rags. They were all men, seemingly around my age. They were all built about the same as me, all wearing the orange Highway Authority vest. Their faces were cast down in dejection or maybe exhaustion. The farmer turned off the truck's engine. He pulled the keys from the ignition and held them out for Ron to take. Ron hadn't moved and didn't see the gesture. At last, the farmer gave up and pressed the keys into Ron's thigh until his hand closed over them. It was happening slowly, but morning was coming. A tired, gray horizon was fading into a soft white glow from beyond the trees. The truck's door handle clicked. I turned and ran. I heard the farmer's boots step onto the concrete as I went. The office was just ahead. From there, another 25 feet to my car. With the white, painted concrete of the office wall within reach, I risked a look back. The farmer had taken no more than 2 steps in my direction and stood, glaring. But he wasn't looking at me. I followed his gaze beyond me to the parking lot. There, I saw what he'd been watching. A black SUV was rolling through the lot. It came to a stop in the parking spot nearest the office. The headlights turned out, and the door opened. A middle-aged man in a brown Carhartt jacket climbed out. He was short and wore a soft expression. Behind me, I heard the pickup's engine start. I turned to look as I heard it accelerating, but it was too late. The lane beside the booth sat unoccupied. The man took a few steps out of the parking lot and regarded me. Then he spoke.
Am I relieving you? What's up? Why aren't you in the booth?
I need the police. Do you have a key to the office? I sputtered. He pulled a confused face and cocked his head slightly.
What do you need the police for?
Do you have a key? I pressed. I need the phone in there. He shook his head.
The office? What, that?
He gestured to the door behind me. After I didn't respond, he carried on.
That's not an office. It's just storage, full of parts for repairs on the booths.
No, that's where the supervisor works, I retorted with an unjustified tone of indignance.
Supervisor? We haven't had an on-site supervisor on the night shift for years, definitely not in my time. Even the daytime supervisor doesn't work in there. He works a booth most of the time.
Then why was Ron on tonight? He's my supervisor, I asked, genuine doubt creeping into my voice.
Who is Ron?
I stared at him. My mouth opened slightly to speak, but no words came to mind. He pressed on.
None of the soups are named Ron. I don't even think we have a toll collector named Ron.
I stood, trying to make sense of what I'd just heard. My new colleague's voice interrupted my thoughts.
Listen, one of us needs to be in the booth. It can't just sit unattended.
Not waiting for me to reply, he turned and stalked off toward the booth. He shouted,
Go home, kid. Get some sleep.
The sun was nearly visible now. The ashen hue of the morning lit up the plaza and road stretching in either direction. The fog was lifting. I remember feeling grateful that my drive home wouldn't be impeded. I watched the man in the booth for a few minutes. He poured himself a coffee from a thermos and settled into a crossword puzzle. He seemed perfectly at ease. When he looked up and noticed me watching, I turned to go. My foot struck something, and it went skittering ahead of me on the pavement. A jagged piece of red plastic. Looking around at my feet, I saw at least a dozen bits of taillight cover. Ron's car. I put in a transfer request the next day, asking to be moved to another role at the Highway Authority. I claimed that the job hadn't been described to me accurately during the interview process. I think they decided that rather than tangle with the union, it would be easier to move me to a warehouse gig. I was going to spend my time taking stock of road signs and rock salt. I don't know what happened that night. My only night as a toll booth operator. I know I saw those cars, those strange people. They never came for me again, never took me beyond wherever that was. But they took some people. God knows if they ever came back. There's one thing I can say for sure. If you have the choice, take the long way. Avoid the tolls.